Hi, my name's Starsky and welcome to From the Studio on Clubbing TV. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Korg's take on FM synthesis. It's the Korg Opsix. Here I've got an original Yamaha Dx7 from 1983, and these were the first mass market digital synths. The FM synths, they don't work in the same way as analog synths. They're really difficult to program. You don't want any of those knobs. The future is all sleek. The future is really impenetrable, or was really impenetrable surfaces like this with just a single slider and lots of buttons and a little screen. But an LCD screen, it was definitely the future back in 1983, and every single track that had a synth on it, almost from 1983 onwards, had a Dx7 on it. And as it's so difficult to program, people relied almost exclusively on the presets like that, and you could hear the same presets on track after track, but if you wanted that sound, you needed a Dx7. And that electronic piano sound's hugely famous, used all over the place, as was that electric bass sound. It's something you just couldn't do on analog synths. But these days they sound really cheesy, and as I say, really difficult to program. To program them, you've got this single slider over here. You try and find your algorithm, you change your algorithm, you're not sure what all the algorithms do. There's a load of algorithms, there's these operators that are like oscillators, and one modulates the other, and it's just the most confusing thing you can imagine, or it was the most confusing thing you can imagine. And if you look here, you can see all the different algorithms. There's 6 different operators. They're basically the oscillators, all in different configurations, and it's just massively confusing. So as I say, everyone stuck to the presets because it sounded different, it sounded good, and it sounded like a pop song straight out of the box. And there's tones in here analog synths just can't do. And that's the reason there was loads of brass sounds on 80s pop records. All of a sudden, you didn't need a brass section. You could get something that sounded like a brass section from a synth player on one of these. Plus, these things were really reliable. They didn't have tuning issues like you get from analog synths. But they did go out of favour because, let's face it, all those sounds are just played a little bit rubbish. So fast forward 20 odd years, 30 odd years maybe, and we come to something like the OP6. I can't help myself, I keep on calling it the OP6, it's actually called the Opsix. Anyway, here it is, and to me the colouring harks back a little bit to the Dx7, but we can see straight away that we've got knobs and sliders. So Opsix, 6 operators, 6 sliders for 6 levels. And as soon as I start playing this, you can hear it's got much more interesting tones. Or maybe I should find one that I can actually play. So start off with that same or similar electric piano sound, and as we flick through this, we can see we've got hundreds of different pianos. Or piano-like sounds at least. So one big difference you get with this is that you get hundreds and hundreds of tones. Oh, that's nice, isn't it? So it's exactly the same basic synthesis method, but it's just, being brought into the future. So the reason we've got 6 sliders and 6 knobs is because we've got the level of each of the operators, or each of the oscillators really. And then we've got the knobs which change the tone by changing the ratio, and without getting all geeky about this. We start off with a single waveform at its most basic form, and that's modulated by another waveform. So on this algorithm here, we've got on the screen, we've got oscillator 1 or operator 1 is modulated by operator 2. So if we turn the level of 2 up, it does stuff to oscillator 1. We're still only listening to number 1. But because 2 is doing things to it, it sounds different. And that's the basis of FM synthesis. All of a sudden we're getting similar tones that you get from a single oscillator analog synth doing a bit of a filter sweep. And that's because the more modulation you put on it, the more harmonics you get. So it's a bit like the opposite of an analog synth where you start off with all these nice harmonic sounding tones and then you take the harmonics out with the filter. With this, you add it. So without oscillator 2 or operator 2, it just sounds like a sine wave because it is just a sine wave, but then if you modulate that, you're starting to program a tone, and you can do that really easily on this. If we go into the envelope generator, we're on oscillator 1 at the minute, so let's go into oscillator 2. And you can hear there's a little envelope on there already. It's not constant all the way through, but if I drop the sustain level, you'll hear it even more. And it's really easy for me to show you how it works on this, because if you know anything about synthesis and how you create tones, all this sort of fits into place and it's easy and quick to do. On the Dx7 though, just doing these little things would have took like 10-15 minutes. To reach for that slider, for example, I had to push a button, go to another button, etc, etc. And the tones don't change while you're modulating the knob on that. They only change once you press another key. So doing this is hard or impossible. And you can start to get really nasty little tones out of it, and I think these have become popular now because just like back in the 80s when people were fed up of analog tones they'd heard throughout the 70s and early 80s, this is just something new, and because it's much more accessible, it's nicer to get to grips with and easier to play with and easier to create your own tones and find really cool little sounds. So there I'm twisting the ratio of operator 4, that's modulating operator 3. And that's changing the harmonics between operator 4 and operator 3, which means the frequency modulation is different because it's a different frequency. And these are tones, as I say, you can't get from analog synths, and they're quite nasty, quite dirty, quite gritty. Fun you just couldn't have on an old FM synth. And to make things even easier with this, we've got this app. So here we've got it running in Logic, and we can see we've got the 6 different oscillators or operators across the top. All of them are playing sines. That's a bit boring. Let's load in that sort of famous Dx7 piano sound. And over on the right hand side here we can see all the various algorithms, and they're the same sort of thing as you got on the Dx7. There was 32 on that, there's 40 on this, but you can add your own as well. So if we go back to the Opsix software, it's easier to show you a few of the little tricks it's got up its sleeve. The big thing this has got over the older synths is that it doesn't rely on sine waves alone. You can use loads of different starting points. So you start off with a wave that's got a lot more harmonics than a sine wave, and then you add even more harmonics to it. Just change the pitch of it. Whoa! Now we're getting there, something really nasty. A quite like that. It's only using 2 operators, don't forget. And then another trick this has got up its sleeve is that it's actually got a filter as well. So you've got an analog style filter as well as the FM controls to do all sorts of different things with the harmonics. Nice, that. So that didn't take long, did it, to get something really usable? On an old one, would have took forever. And it's exactly the same sound engine as you get on the hardware. Another of its little tricks is the effects. Let's add some reverb. Maybe let's change the spring reverb into a shimmer to get all those little high little twinkles. Very nice, and there's a nice one that Korg used on the Minilog XD called Submarine. It's like an inverse shimmer, so it sort of drops rather than goes higher. Interesting and very nice. So there's loads of little things to look at on the OP6 that I've not really gone into, like the sequencer and the modulation lanes, for example. But all in all, what are my final thoughts? This is a really interesting synth, and it fits alongside Korg's others in this sort of range, like the mod wave and the wave state. The form factor's great. 3 octaves, prefer maybe a few more octaves, maybe 4 octaves, but actually for the size of it, it means you can fit more of them in the studio, and it fits on your desk a lot easier. And people tend not to play synths now over a lot of octaves. You play some parts on your bass and you play some parts in your pads, but you tend not to mix them up like they did in the olden days, shall we say. When you're playing a synth, you're not playing the piano, you're playing synth parts, so it doesn't really bother me too much, but some people get really annoyed by it. But all in all, I think it's a great sounding little synth. It's about £500, 450, £500, so it's not cheap. Does it feel like a quality synth? It feels like it's been put together quite well. It's a bit light, it's plasticky, for example. It doesn't feel like your top-end special synth in the studio, but it feels really hands-on. It's cleverly laid out, and there's loads and loads to play with. If you got one of these, you'd be busy for a year. You'd be busy from one Christmas to the next Christmas, saving up for your next one. So it comes highly recommended. Do have a play with it if you want to get your hands on it, and if you really want to have a play with what the sounds sound like, it's definitely worth downloading the Korg Opsix native app, or Opsix native app, because that'll give you the exact experience of what you can get from the hardware. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and don't forget, if you liked it, you can watch it whenever you like on our Clubbing TV official YouTube channel on the From the Studio playlist. And don't forget that I've got my Starsky Carr YouTube channel. I've got a demo of this versus the Dx7 in depth, and also maybe join me over on Patreon, where I've got some sounds for the DX7 as well that you can use on your Dx7 if you just happen to have a 40-year-old synth lying around. Anyway, I will see you in the next episode of From the Studio.